today. That means that if you're asking a question, that will be captured in the recording. If you want to, you can ask us to remove it from the recording. So welcome everyone to our 5th webinar from the European Worktime Network. So we are a network working on worktime reduction in Europe. We started having webinars on different topics as of this year. And if there's anything you're interested in hearing more about, if there's any topic on the 4-day work week or work time reduction more generally, please do get in touch with us. We're happy to approach different types of speakers for you and set something up. Today, we are going to be speaking on winning work time reduction campaigns and coalitions. And we have 2 great speakers. We are starting with Joe Moore, which is the Business Network Coordinator of the 4-day week. And then we have Dr. Will Strong, who is the co-founder and director of research at Autonomy. So I'm just gonna quickly hand over first to Joe. You're speaking for 15-20 minutes, and then we'll move over to Will, and then we'll take questions at the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alexandra. Am I able to share my presentation?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
You should have a green little button called share screen at the bottom.
Yeah.
I've made it so you should be able to share, Joe. So just let me know if there's a problem.
Not sure if you froze there. Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Better.
We can see it now. Maybe you want to put it in presenter mode.
Yes.
Perfect. That's great.
Okay. Thank you. Brilliant. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. And of course, thank you for having me. So as you may know, I'm Joe, the Business Network Coordinator at the 4-day week campaign. And I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about campaigns and coalitions on which to build support for reduced working time. Just to kind of set my stall out, and give you a flavour of what's to come. I'll start by talking about why coalitions are important in campaigning before moving on to a discussion of sort of which groups we should be thinking, about engaging any work time reduction efforts and building a campaign around. I'll then dive into a discussion of each of these groups individually, saying why they're important for our purposes and using kind of historical and
Oh, Joe, I think you're cutting out a little bit. Am I the only one think he's cutting out a little bit for everyone else? Yeah. Okay, it's just cutting out a little bit. We'll see how it goes, Joe. Maybe if you cancel your video, but keep sharing your screen, maybe that'll help.
So, Joe, at the moment, we can't hear you at all. Joe, can you hear us? Okay. What I will suggest is that maybe we change the order of our speakers, and I'll ask you to start, and then I'll wait until Joe is back, and we'll ask him to go second. Thank you.
Yeah. No worries. Okay. Well, hi everyone, and hi everyone who's watching this as a recording. My name is Will Strong. I'm the co-founder and co-director of Autonomy, and now for those that don't know us, we're a research organisation based in the UK, but also we have people outside of the UK, and our focus is on the future of work, really. So let me just let Joe back in. The future of work in a kind of holistic sense, so both kind of the labour market, non-standard work, standard work, paid work, unpaid work, so the work at home as well, and all things around kind of where we're going, where should we be going. So the future of care work, the future of automation, green job, like that. Now, we focus on the 4-day week quite a lot, or the idea of a shorter working week, quite a lot over our 6-year lifespan. We've done kind of all sorts of research you can find on our website. And I guess what's interesting about the way we go about thinking about working time is not just in terms of macroeconomic research or kind of theoretical research, but also kind of working with firms and trade unions on a shop floor level to help kind of implement a shorter working week, and firm by firm as well. So we have both a kind of 4-day week consultancy where we run pilots in firms, but also the kind of more macroeconomic research, more policy work where we work with political parties and governments. Welcome back, Joe. Joe, we're now kind of switching the order, so we're going to go with me first. So I think broadly speaking, I think I probably won't take the full 15 minutes, but I think broadly speaking, we're seeing different or 4 different ways in which the 4-day week or the shorter working week is being won, or that this movement is progressing basically. I think we're seeing lots of pilots being run both by the private sector, which we've been involved in ourselves, but others have been involved in. Those pilots are very important because they give us a kind of set of evidence, a set of precedents for kind of understanding kind of the potential impacts of a shorter working week and all sorts of different metrics. First and foremost, staff, but also business performance. So you see the kind of pilot and then convert kind of strategy. And that's, obviously small cohorts of the labor market of the economy, but nonetheless still very useful for that kind of evidence. Then you have kind of local authorities or other bodies kind of just trying it in their own workplaces. So obviously in the public sector, there's lots of control over the workplace. So you can kind of, in terms of being able to kind of try new work practices without kind of having that being at the whim of an employer that you have to kind of convince. The government or the public sector is the employer, as it were. So if you're a progressive council or local authority and you think this is actually something that would be beneficial both for your services but also for your staff, you see that kind of element. And then you also see kind of trade unions winning this in the workplace as well. So obviously the shorter working week has a long history as a demand within workers' movements, labor movements, going well back into the 19th century. And I'm writing a book right now. I'm finishing a book right now. God, it feels like I've been writing this for ages, where one of the chapters is on the history of the shorter working week, and particularly looking at the US as an example. So going way back into the mid-19th century, particularly the debates around slavery, the debates following the Civil War around working hours, and finding all sorts of different kind of historical gems, things like winning the 4-day week, even in the 1870s. Coopers, who are kind of now not really a profession anyone really knows, but Coopers used to make barrels. And there's Coopers in New York who were winning 4-day weeks back in the 1870s, 80s, as well as all sorts of other kind of interesting historical trajectories. So the shorter working week's been a traditional trade union demand, right? And now we're seeing kind of a resurgence of that to some extent because of the higher profile of working time reduction. So obviously the famous examples in the UK have been the CWU, the Communication Workers Union over the last few years, but also unions like PCS in Scotland, IG Metall in Germany, UAW, United Auto Workers in America. And so winning those in workplaces and then also at a wider sectoral level is also another really important route here. So, and I guess I think, so we're seeing these kind of different phenomena, and they're kind of sometimes matching up and sometimes stitching together, and sometimes they're just happening in isolation. And I think we can distill from that 3 or 4 distinct strategies about how we win the shorter working week, basically. I think on the one hand, we have the public sector. Now, I think the public sector, as I've kind of alluded to, is both, of course, there is the government as a policymaker. So there is making the case to government, to political parties to adopt shorter working hours policies. And I guess given that this is given that I'm here with the 4-day week campaign from the UK, we should point to the mini manifesto that the 4-day week campaign coordinated between ourselves at Autonomy, the New Economics Foundation, and other groups, Women's Budget Group, and so on. So there is the case to kind of you need to make that argument to government and to political parties to adopt policies. But there's also the public sector as an employer. Now, I'm a bit of a broken record on this, but even though the public sector in some ways is a tough nut to crack in terms of shorter working hours, i.e. in many cases, you will need to be spending money on new hires, so healthcare, education, things like that, even though there is, in some parts of the public sector, a cost involved in deploying the shorter working week. It's also perhaps the most important sector of the economy that we need to be doing this in. So teachers, healthcare workers, and so on, exhausted. If I can name a set of workers that I would like to not be exhausted, it'd be those that are taking care of me or teaching my kids or whatever. So I think there's a really strong case to be made there. But more strategically, in terms of winning the shorter working week, should we move the public sector to a working week, you then shift whole swathes of the economy to a new standard of employment. We've done some work on this, a report called the Public Sector as Pioneer back in 2020. Some parts of Wales, north of England, Scotland have between 25 and 33% of all employment in the area is public sector employment. So if you shift the public sector to 4-day weeks, then you change the expectations of the labour market across the UK. And that's the case in many, many countries. So it's both a very strategic aim to shift the public sector, but also one in which actually it's ethically and morally a good thing to start there, or go there at least, and kind of make inroads. We shouldn't be afraid of it. It's a really strategically important place. Second prong of the trident that is the 4-day week strategy, trade unions. I think this is in contrast to the firm by firm strategy, which some think is the way to go, to just run pilots in firms or in cohorts of firms. In contrast to that, shifting sectors and key sectors. This is how the shorter working week has been won in the UK in the past. Construction and mining post World War II are very key sectors. So trade unions are incredibly important at kind of scaling up what we now know from firm level experiments. So that's really important. So public sector strategically kind of almost like would be almost like the most at scale significant kind of shift, but trade unions across sectors super important too. So and what does that involve? That involves the campaigns like the 4-day week that Joe's at and others, working with trade unions to kind of build those strategies and build those coalitions for those key moments and so on, and also help them in their work. And we do the same, right? So we produce research so that people can look at this evidence and look at this analysis to understand and how to make the case to either within their campaigns and things like that. And then finally, I'm going to let Joe talk about campaigning. That would be the fourth prong of my kind of trident, or whatever quadrant, whatever 4-prong trident is. But the third prong, I think, is these early adopters. Now, I know it's a bit of a cliche, it's a bit tired now to say this, but early adopting firms are really significant, even though they are the least scaled strategy. If you get a few large firms, as we're seeing now, and I suspect there are going to be more and more kind of coming out of the woodwork and adopting shorter working weeks going forward. If you have a few large, high-profile firms, but also just like greater and greater cohorts of piloted shorter working week converted private sector firms, we've seen the significance of that happening, right? We've seen how the UK government has had to kind of react to these kind of questions put to them about why is it that if the private sector can innovate like this, why can't the public sector, for example? So you see that kind of relationship between the arguments between public and private sector. You see kind of the business press, all sorts of different kind of let's say not usual suspects talking about why it's a new business practice, a new perk, things like that. That stuff shouldn't be sniffed at, even though we might agree that we need to have the other parts of the strategy in place. That stuff is still really significant, and in fact, obviously, it's had the most success, partly because it's the easiest to implement. A business can just kind of run it, and we can point to that evidence, whereas the other parts of the strategy are longer term, kind of building momentum and so on. So I think those three are the kind of different, they're kind of distilled from what's already happening out there. I think those three seem to me to be the kind of different terrains upon which this is being moved. Autonomy tries to work across all three, obviously speaking to the public sector, speaking to private businesses, and also working with trade unions. So I think I would say that, but that's kind of a strategy that we've seen some success kind of with. So I will probably leave it there. And I guess, given there's a small amount of us in the room, we can probably have a, kind of open up a discussion after Joe's, just amongst ourselves about, about this, of course. But I'll probably leave it there. So I'll let Joe take it away. Hopefully your internet connection's a bit better.
Thank you so much, Will. For those that are interested, I did share the publication that you mentioned, Public Sector as a Pioneer, in the chat. And and we'll try to upload this to our website as well, just so people can easily access this. I'll hand over to you now, Joe, and hopefully this time we're going to have a stable connection.
Yes, thank you, Will and Alexandra. Yeah, I'm back after a brief hiatus. Yeah, hopefully it's going to hold up this time. How am I coming through now? Am I okay? Maybe a bit better? Good, good. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about campaigns and coalitions. I'll build on some of the things Will said, and also kind of reiterate a couple of things as well, which I think are really important. So yeah, just to kind of set my stall and tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start by talking about why campaigns and coalitions are kind of important before moving on to a sort of a discussion of which groups we should be thinking about seeking support from when building a campaign for reduced working time. And then kind of use some historical and contemporary examples from the 4-day week campaign of how we've had success in engaging these groups and how I think, we should be proceeding. So the political scientist and campaign expert Ian Shapiro calls coalitions one of the main building blocks, or one of the fundamental building blocks of distributive politics, and a key sort of part of political change. So it's clearly important that we get these coalitions right. But what sort of groups do we want to build a coalition around when looking at kind of reduced working time and the 4-day week? And there are a number, I think, of sort of groups we can engage, but I'm going to focus on kind of 3 in particular, which are businesses, trade unions, and politicians and policymakers. Of course, there are other groups that are also important. We can't overlook the importance of sort of academics, the media, grassroots groups, and kind of international networks. But I'm not going to spend too much time talking about those things. I'm sure everyone here is kind of well versed on some of those, but they should be borne in mind nevertheless. So the first group that I think is a really important part of any kind of coalition to reduce working time is business. Business has always been, it's important to remember, politically powerful, but today I think business is more powerful than ever. So the idea that we're going to see any kind of political change without contending with sort of business interests is, pie in the sky. Particularly for something like any kind of reduced working time or the 4-day week. And if we look at historical parallels, for instance, we look at the introduction of the 5-day week, we can see how business was instrumental, though one of its greatest supporters was Henry Ford, whose productivity studies showed that, workers performed better in 5 days because they were more well rested, and that was quite influential in the introduction of the 5-day week. So in many cases, businesses are going to be some of the most effective kind of spokespeople for the 4-day week, and that's certainly one of the things we found at the campaign. But one thing to note, I think, is that for a lot of businesses, there's an initial reluctance around kind of the 4-day week and reducing working time. Seen by something that's kind of much more for workers, and again, businesses sometimes see it as detrimental. But in reality, the 4-day week, any like reduced working time, it's an asset for businesses that want to improve the performance. It's a win-win for businesses and workers. But because businesses don't necessarily realize this, it's important that you have a business case. To kind of get businesses on board. And that's one of the things we did at the campaign. We built a really strong business case for the 4-day week, just like Henry Ford had done with his productivity studies. And a lot of this was based on the data from the 4-day week trial that was run by us and Autonomy and other international trials as well. And like I said, I won't dive in too deeply into that kind of business case, but it really focused on kind of the amount of companies that were really taken with a 4-day week, the 92% retention rate, the kind of improved revenue, productivity, the recruitment and retention benefits, the environmental benefits, all those sorts of things. We produced a really strong kind of evidence-based business case for the 4-day week, which businesses quite like. And then on top of that, we built, a lot of resources, kind of one of which is the rollout program, which we run with Autonomy, that kind of gets the shepherds businesses into a position where they're ready to sort of undergo a 4-day week trial. So alongside the business case and the other resources, we also start to build relationships with 4-day week companies, and many of these have become advocates for the 4-day week since. We often work with these companies to kind of promote the 4-day week through the rollout program, but also kind of external events. It's kind of strategically chosen events and with groups that have large business memberships. Just to give you sort of one example, we very recently ran an event with 2 4-day week employees at the Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce. It's one of the UK's largest regional chambers. It has about 4,000 businesses that are members, and we took some of our 4-day week employers that we'd work with, and we made that business case. Yeah, and we find that businesses really tend to like that, hearing from other businesses that have successfully implemented a 4-day weekend, particularly if it's a similarly situated company to themselves. We also at the campaign launched an accreditation scheme where we kind of certify 4-day week companies. As of 150 businesses signed up, and we publicize that quite visibly on our social media, and that encourages other businesses to investigate the sort of the 4-day week. So that's the business side of things. Another sort of important part of any coalition, I think, for reduced working time is trade unions. Now, trade unions have always historically been at the forefront of the effort to reduce working time, and they're always going to be a key part of any coalition for any future campaign of a similar nature. As Will touched on. And I'm sure it'd be a fascinating read in his book. It's trade unions that led the charge for a 5-day week. Yes, so it's quite evident that trade unions have been a key part of any campaign to reduce working time historically. In fact, we should be engaging with trade unions as much as possible in any effort to reduce working time, particularly because it's actually sort of one of the key demands of workers. It's what workers want. According to polling, a 4-day week with no loss of pay is now more popular than it has ever been, and it regularly comes out on top as the change that workers want to see in the workplace the most. It's very, very important. It's clearly something that workers want, but the process of actually engaging with trade unions is sort of a more difficult nut to crack. So thinking about some of the ways that we can do this, we might attend and speak at trade union meetings and increase our engagement with unions. We might work with unions to launch a number of kind of workplace campaigns for reduced working time. We might work with workplace groups interested in campaigning for a 4-day week, or even engage with the unions at a national level and speak at kind of conferences and things. And then even kind of draft some materials that might be helpful for unions, sort of like draft pay claims and sort of, that incorporate the 4-day week. And again, just providing sort of ongoing support and assistance in ways we can, and engaging with the unions more. And then the final group, that I think is key for any kind of sort of coalition for reduced working time is, your politicians and your policymakers. After all, they're the kind of people who influence the legislature. They legislate around working time, and they look to for leadership on key issues such as working time. Just as voters are able to mobilize politicians are also able to mobilize voters. And again, just to kind of come full circle, as with a 5-day week, the first 2 groups in the coalition that I talked about so far, businesses and trade unions, they're both effective routes to gaining political support in this way. But advocacy work, is also a key part of building effective support for reduced working time in politics. And just to talk a little bit about how that can be effective and how it's been effective at the 4-day week campaign. After the success of the private sector trial, that again, like I said, was run by us and Autonomy, 92% of companies keeping the 4-day week and all those other kinds of business benefits, we then began to campaign. We then began to campaign for a public sector trial of the 4-day week as a solution to many of the local government issues around recruitment and retention. I remember at the time the dominant statistic was, from the local government association, that 9 out of 10 councils across the country, were struggling massively with job recruitment and retention, and they were wasting something, I think it was 2 billion a year on agency workers to plug the gaps. And so eventually it was South Cambridgeshire District Council that took up that mantle, and resulting in the 4-day week has saved them over £300,000, and with no noticeable change in performance. And that experience now from South Cambridge District Council, has shown council leaders across the country that the 4-day week is a really potent solution to the problems they're facing. So yeah, the advocacy and the campaigning work is it's very powerful, not to be underestimated. Much of our advocacy work in doing the trials and building the evidence again with autonomy, building that evidence base for the 4-day week and campaigning on that evidence has meant now, that more and more kind of people in politics and policymakers are taking the 4-day week, very seriously. It's supported by a range of MPs from a number of different parties, and quite significantly, the SNP are now set to trial a 4-day week in Scotland. And just as Will touched on, the publication of our mini manifesto, which we developed with Autonomy and the New Economics Foundation, which again I won't delve into too deeply, but I can provide copies of that, like I said, along with other resources such as the business case that we developed. Yes, like I say, I won't delve into too deeply, except to say that it's the document that we're campaigning on ahead of the next general election, and that as a kind of tool of advocacy, as a piece of advocacy, has received support from across the political spectrum, with it being back from a number of parties. So yeah, I'll just sort of start to wrap up and conclude. Ultimately, we should be looking to build a coalition of many sort of influential groups for reduced working time. But these three in particular, sort of businesses, trade unions, and politicians, I think the key pillars, largely because this is what history teaches us is effective, but also because the current evidence and like the experience we have from the campaign, reminds us that it remains an effective strategy for reducing working time. I hope that all came through. I hope there was no sort of connection issues. Thank you everyone very much for bearing with me. And yeah, I'll hand back over to Alexandra.
Thank you so much. No, that was a massive improvement. I also have things jumping up on my computer now saying low system resources. So maybe it's just one of those days. I would open sort of if there are any questions, but I will open the questions by asking a question myself, because as the chair, you have the sort of right to be able to do so. If anyone else have any questions, I would just say, like, literally ask the question, because we're a fairly small group. But you said that the first, or both of you have talked about the sort of role of businesses, and what we're seeing at the moment is quite a lot of pilots that are happening, so there's a clear interest. What would you say is normally the reason why a firm is engaging with the 4-day work week or general work time reduction? And you said you had or you, Joe, mentioned that you had basically a toolkit built up for sort of how to approach those situations. Do you want to just talk us through that a little bit on what is happening? And Will, I'm happy for you to also comment on this, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of address the first part of your question, as why a business is taking up the 4-day week. I think there are a range of reasons. Some employers, want to do something really nice for the workers. They want to reward the workers. Others are responding to kind of short-term, difficulties, and see kind of the 4-day week as a solution. There was one employer I think we spoke to who was having trouble raising pay. I think he actually had to decrease pay for some of his employees. So as a kind of mitigating sort of benefit, he introduced the 4-day week. But as a result of that, his employees resultantly became more productive, and then he was able to find that he was able to raise pay to at least the same level it was before it was cut, or if not improved, and maintain the 4-day week. So there are some short-term problems, I think, and also some longer-term problems. Britain, famously has a productivity problem. So I think a lot of employers are responding to that. Like I said, the recruitment and retention issues is key for councils. So I think there's a range of issues that businesses and even in the public sector are responding to.
I'm going to add to that, as in our experience, I mean, ever since we started our service, which was basically like 2018, the first group companies that were coming to us were basically those that were having serious recruitment issues, like issues like having a vacancy open for well over a year, and the vacancy itself saying that in order to apply for this job you have to have a year's worth of experience. So the fact that this vacancy was open for longer than the experience necessary for the job itself was like a real problem. That was in marketing sectors, basically. So recruitment has been a massive pull for companies coming to the idea of a shorter working week. Obviously, in the last few years, this whole Great Resignation element, and also the sheer amount of people suffering from mental health issues, often driven by work-related stress, anxiety, and depression, has meant that firms are kind of looking for new solutions, and they realize that a lot of these well-being solutions, like kind of well-being webinars and things like that, just don't cut the mustard. So recruitment and retention have been incredibly important for firms in the past few years, for sure, and that's translated into a lot more companies coming to us, basically. There's also, of course, the low-hanging fruit of companies who, as Joe was saying, are generally quite good employers, already have different kind of decent working conditions and want to add something new. There's also obviously a case of managers also recognizing for themselves to be hugely significant and transformative. So managers who are thinking, okay, well, there's actually these other benefits, but also personally, this will improve my work-life balance and so on. So there's obviously that element too. I think beyond that, we have had a few cases where people do think about their environmental footprint, and this is exactly part of the remit. I mean, particularly large corporates have kind of requirements to show what action they're taking in order to reduce carbon footprint. So we have a bit of that. And then, of course, there's also equality angles, particularly gender equality, and those with disabilities, for those who suffer from things like exhaustion and things like that. We have had a bit of that as well, where there's part of that kind of remit in a company. They need to kind of think about what policy to be putting in place. Now, all these arguments sound very strong, and obviously we a lot of us here will probably agree with a lot of these cases. But obviously, it does take often, as Joe was saying, there is a bit of reticence on behalf of management to think about these new working practices. So you really do have to kind of make that case, and we do have to sharpen those arguments, basically.
Building on what you've just said, in the firms that are engaging with this, are there any industry sectors or types of firms that you almost never see, that never approach you, that are hardest to sort of penetrate, that you've identified?
I'll go first, I guess, Joe. Let me think about that. I'm sure it's hard to think about the unknown, those that haven't come forward. There's plenty, right? This is still an idea which is kind of really just kind of spreading. I mean, I guess the profile of the idea is very is really, really strong and really high. It's a high profile right now, right? But in terms of adoption, I mean, I think we shouldn't get into the trap of thinking that it's the hardest sectors that are the ones that are not coming forward. So I mean, we talk to NHS trusts, for example, care homes, things like this. Like there's a lot of initiative for people saying, look, we really need this. Just like I was saying, the public sector really is the kind of, it might be a tough nettle to grasp, but it's one that we need to really grasp. So it's not the case that the sectors which might be hardest to do without a cost are the ones that aren't coming forward. It's actually that they do actually have a certain kind of level of representation in, let's say, the cohort that come to us. But I think, I guess what we don't get is those sectors where like, I suppose what we don't have so far is we haven't had, for example, finance, which often work crazy hours in the city, for example. Those, I would suspect that those sectors which have quite toxic work, I would call them quite toxic work ethics, 70-hour weeks sometimes, things like that, because that's just the nature of the game in the city. They haven't, they haven't come to us. Even though the long hours, exhausting hours in the public sector, they are just as grueling, there's also an awareness that actually, people deserve a decent work life, basically. Whereas I think in finance and in the city, it's particularly acute. So I haven't heard yet from, one of the firms in the city. But I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I just haven't heard from
them. Thank you very much. Joe.
Yeah, just to sort of touch on and follow on a little bit from what Will was saying. It's certainly true that there are kind of industries and sectors where it's slightly more difficult to implement, slightly more complicated, but again, it doesn't mean we haven't seen these companies coming forward. Sometimes when you speak to people, they often say like, well, how would this work in something like construction or manufacturing? But we have construction manufacturing companies that are working 4-day weeks. And if you want to sort of read a little bit more about that, we have a collection of case studies on our website, on the 4-day week website, where we delve into sort of how it was, possible to implement a 4-day week in these sectors, which, might be typically considered a bit of a tougher nut to crack. And yeah, again, as Will said, so some of these sort of sectors or industries where there's particularly long working hours, particularly tough working conditions. One of which I can think of is hospitality. Where the uptake in that sector is not quite as prevalent as it is in other sectors, but that doesn't mean that it's not been done, that there aren't examples of that. That there was a 4-day week in the hospitality sector in a company called, I think it was 91212, a restaurant in Scotland. Where they successfully implemented a 4-day week. So yeah, the uptake might not always be significant or standard across lots of different sectors, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible, and there aren't examples of companies taking it up in those sectors.
Thank you very much. That is interesting, and I agree. I think it's actually one of those where I sort of automatically think of non-engagement as difficulties, but we do actually see a lot of engagement from those areas, although they might not implement it yet. Is there any other questions to our speakers today? If there are no other questions, is there anything that our speakers wants to add before we sort of round up? Or
I can make a question.
Of course.
I was just trying to look for my hand in the Zoom settings, but I couldn't find it. So my question was related to this historical approach that Joe was mentioning. Like, what can we really learn from history? And I just have a different reading to the one you share with us, because you emphasize the importance of Henry Ford and how he got to convince other American industrialists. I recently came across this this reading. I'm sharing it in the Zoom by Rediger, and the title is "The Limits of Corporate Reformism." And he actually questions, did Henry Ford really achieve what he expected in terms of convincing other fellow capitalists? And he makes more emphasis in the decade before the experiment of Henry Ford, which is 1926. So he was really looking at the first decade of the 20th century, and the argument that he makes is that it was really the mobilization of workers, the strikes, the campaigning for the 5-day work week, which really changed the pattern, instead of Henry Ford's good intentions. Because at least the argument he makes is that no one or very few corporate leaders really trusted that this would benefit their productivity. So I'm using this as an introduction to ask you, how can we, because you mentioned the importance of attracting unions as well. That I understand it's not either or. Ideally, we want everyone to be on board. But how can you win the trust of unions and workers? Whereas when sometimes it might seem that this is more of an employer-led policy, that it's only focused on productivity, but it doesn't discuss so much inequalities, how wealth is distributed in the firm, and of course, it can also lead to undesirable outcomes such as labor intensity, people not having enough control because now they need to speed up to fulfilling what they used to do in 5 days. So how can we trust, or how do we make that workers trust in the movement? And what are the boundaries of the 4-day work week? When we say 4-day work week, what are we willing to say these are our constraints, and we won't accept another form that maybe affects workers in certain ways?
Yeah. Great question, Jose. Lots to unpack there. So I'm a historian kind of by trade. That's what I do. And you're certainly right that when you're looking at was it unions or was it Henry Ford, the majority, the sort of largest role was played by the unions, certainly. But I think might not have been sort of the most effective method at the time. But I think there's certainly something in that. I think there's certainly a valuable lesson in kind of getting businesses to lead the way, get businesses to become advocates for this policy for reduced working time. Even if in Henry Ford's case, it might not have been overwhelmingly successful. And in terms of contemporary sort of evidence, just to pull it back to where we are now, the campaign, we found it's been quite an effective strategy. Businesses really like to hear from other businesses who've implemented it, might not necessarily a 4-day week, but any reduction in working time, and they seem to be really sort of receptive, really responsive to other businesses, particularly in the same sector. And one of the most common questions we get asked is, is there a business just like us who've implemented a 4-day week that we can speak to? So there's certainly an appetite for it. And just in terms of sort of this other part of your question, about how can we get workers to trust and sort of believe in the 4-day week? I think we've gone a long way to that. I mentioned the polling, which shows the 4-day week as kind of one of the most desirable sort of workplace changes that workers want to see. So it's always important to keep sort of pushing the envelope, keep pushing the agenda, keep it on the radar of workers as a desirable policy. But I think there's a lot of trust in the idea already, but of course it's important to maintain that.
Thank you very much. Will, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think it's, I think what the discussion we just had there, sorry, I am going to add something. I think the discussion that what Joe's response to Jose's question shows that it's always in all the kind of push for progressive change, there's always alliances, whether it's, some much more comfortable, some less comfortable, would, trade union campaign organization, would they speak the same language as an employer over here? No. That's just the nature of the beast of change, basically. So I think that's something we've got to keep in mind. And I think something that the 4-day-week campaign itself is the kind of fourth prong that I was thinking about. Social campaigns, activist campaigns have to kind of keep those things in mind, and then also understand the general landscape as to which case is being made. And this is something we talked about more recently. Which case of all the different cases for a 4-day week are the most prominent, which ones need to have a bit more of an airing, those kind of things. I think is part of the strategy that we need to be considering, basically, kind of that balance. That's what I'd say. Thanks for sharing, Alex.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. There's been some very interesting discussions happening today. Also been some amazing English sayings about pies in skies and everything, and I've been really enjoying them as well, from both of you. Thank you so much to everyone attending today's webinar. We have another webinar coming up in November, Jose, do you have information of that webinar?
Not yet.
We will be sending that out in our communications from the European network. We will also be uploading today's webinar to the website, and we will include the links that have been shared in today's meeting. So thanks to both our speakers, thanks to our participants, and we'll see you in the next webinar in a month. Bye, everyone.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.